Hillary Clinton, and this is 2012 when she was Secretary of State, and she wrote in that email, the best way to help Israel is to use force to overthrow the government in Syria. Where is there American interest in overthrowing the government in Syria? None. But this proves that Obama and Hillary Clinton were serving Israeli ends, not American. So 22 years after it was first promoted, this idea of a war on terror in Jerusalem, it became reality with 9/11. It was born. Now I'm going to talk about the Israeli connections to 9/11. Number one, ideation. The Israelis put out the idea that planes might be flying into big buildings one day. This is a film by a senior Israeli agent named Arnon Milchan, a Hollywood producer, a very high-level Israeli agent. He made this film in 1978 called The Medusa Touch, in which a large Boeing plane flies into the Pan Am building in New York City. This is from the movie. Now, is this coincidence or is this prescience? Now, the thing is that he's very close, and the picture shows him with the defense minister of Israel, Ezer Weizman. This is at the very highest level of Israeli military intelligence. And here he's making the movie. Here he is, he's worth $5.2 billion, and you can see he's very close to the very highest level establishment in Israel. Shimon Peres and Bibi Netanyahu, two of the most notorious Israeli terrorists in history. Then, in the year 2000, with his business partner Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, they made a TV program called The Lone Gunman, in which a Boeing 757 is flown into the World Trade Center. And this was on TV in March 2001 on Fox News. 13 million people watched it. This is putting the idea out there into your mind that planes might be striking big buildings one day. Now, the next thing is, the father of Israeli intelligence, this man Isser Harel, he predicted in 1979 that Islamic or Arabs would attack the tallest buildings in New York City. He predicted it to this man, this Jewish man here with Menachem Begin, and he said, Mr. Evans asked Harel, Isser Harel, do you think terrorism will come to America, and if so, where and why? Isser Harel said, yes, I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism. As to where, Harel continued, New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike your tallest building and a symbol of your power. 1979, 22 years before 9/11. Then number three, the Israeli Mossad got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1987. Because they actually intended that 9/11 would happen in the 1980s, but they were delayed. Because the Port Authority discovered that the man involved was not only an Israeli intelligence agent, but he was using a fake name. He was using a false name. They often do. So they tore up the contract. The Port Authority, the owners of the World Trade Center, they tore up the contract. Had they not done that, 9/11 would have happened, as I say, in the late 80s. But when those Israelis were thwarted, they didn't go back to Israel. They went to work with American Jews who were working in the World Trade Center, namely Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. And in 1993, when the building was bombed the first time, Jules Kroll, the man at the top here, got the security contract for the World Trade Center. And at that time, that Israeli man that was the head of the Shin Bet was now working for him. So they used a Trojan horse to get into the World Trade Center. Number four, Israeli military intelligence created Al-Qaeda. They created the Islamic foe for the war on terror. Because if you're going to have a big war on terror, you have to have an enemy. So they have to create the enemy. So under Ehud Barak in the early 1980s, Israeli military intelligence trained a group in Pakistan of Afghan fighters and Arabs called Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, faction Hizb Islami. At this time, this is when the what they call the Afghan Arabs. The Arabs came to Afghanistan to help the Afghan fighters against the Russian army, the Soviet army. And this is the time when Israeli military intelligence under Ehud Barak, this man on the left, was running the operation. The CIA was paying for it, and Saudi Arabia were paying for it. Pakistan was the host country, and Israel military intelligence was doing the training in the army. It was done by a guy named Charlie Wilson, a congressman from Texas. But the question was, why would the CIA and Israelis, why would they arm the most anti-Western group out there? Because they were creating the group that became Al-Qaeda, and it had to be extremely anti-Western. The Mossad connection. Charlie Wilson was a congressman in Washington, but his handler was the head of Mossad in Washington, D.C., this man, Zvi Rafia. He was the handler of Charlie Wilson since 1973. He managed him. And this Israeli agent used Charlie Wilson's congressional office as if it were his own. As you can see from the book here, Charlie Wilson's War, Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. And they together put together this operation. This is bin Laden's first trainer. He's a man named Ali Mohammed. He's a Hebrew-speaking Egyptian, if you believe that. And this man was involved in all of those terror attacks that happened in the 1990s. This man set up the cell in Nairobi that bombed the American embassies in Africa. This man trained the guy who killed Rabbi Kahane. And then he was put in federal penitentiary, and he disappeared from federal penitentiary without a trace. Then the group, Gulbuddin, that the Israelis had trained, became Al-Qaeda in 1994. They became Al-Qaeda. Now, if you understand the current situation with ISIS, Al-Qaeda then became ISIS. So it's the Israelis create this cadre, this group of terrorists, who then change names and change places, but they remain the target. So when America strikes ISIS, when America strikes Al-Qaeda, they're actually striking Islamic nations. They're not hitting the enemy. They're fighting ISIS. They're hitting infrastructure, power plants, water plants, hospitals. Then this is about 1993, the first bombing in the World Trade Center. The first bombing in the World Trade Center, to my mind, was to put in your mind the idea that Arabs are trying to blow up the World Trade Center. So the interesting thing that this narrative was given to us by an Israeli, Michael Chertoff, who was the prosecutor in this case in 1993, and Judge Michael Mukasey, a fellow Zionist, was the judge who oversaw the whole thing. Now, if you remember, the bomb went off, and 8 people died, or 6 people died, and the FBI paid this Egyptian colonel here $1 million to testify. He was the informant. He was the one who kind of like set these people up, the blind sheikh. The blind sheikh didn't blow up the World Trade Center, the FBI did. Here we have plan number 6, it's the Zionist plan for the new Pearl Harbor. This was planned in advance. This man, Philip Zelikow, had a catastrophic terrorism study group in which they were imagining the transforming event that would change this nation. This was published 2 years before 9/11. Another one of the authors was Ashton Carter, top left, and the man with the blue sweater. These are Rothschild agents. These men, when they wrote that paper, were working for a group called Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. Their whole business is getting onto the gravy train of American defense spending. That's where the money is. They take the money from us, they put it into war, and the Rothschilds profit from it. And another group was PNAC, Project for a New American Century. They said that the process of transforming the American military into this worldwide dominant force would be a long change, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, which is exactly what 9/11 was meant to be. Now, this is another point. The Israeli Mossad controlled security at U.S. airports, the key U.S. airports, on 9/11. And the men that ran this company, ICTS, based in Holland, are these characters here. Mr. Shukerman Yair Shamir, the son of Shamir, and Boaz Harel. It's a Rothschild company. They controlled passenger screening at Boston Airport, Newark Airport, etc. They controlled who got on the planes. Now, then again, Israelis created false histories for these men. 15 of these 19 supposed hijackers lived in Florida, where many of them had been given duplicate licenses, and others had reported having lost their passports. So what you have is a game where you have two people that are using the same identity. One is an Israeli agent that looks like him, and one is the person himself. In this way, they leave a fake trail for that person, incriminating him. This is explained in the very good book, The Little Drummer Girl by John le Carré. It's an Israeli plot. It's an Israeli action. This is what they do. They leave fake trails for people. They incriminate them. And in the book, the Mossad person says to this actress, terror is theater. Theater's a con trick. Do you know what that means, con trick? You've been deceived. 9/11, in July 2001, Zionists got the lease for the World Trade Center. Zionist is, again, Israeli nationalists, people who believe in Israel over everything else. It's a political ideology. It's not a religion, it's not a race, it's not an ethnicity. It's a political ideology, flat and simple. Now, how that happened, how did Larry Silverstein get the World Trade Center is very interesting. He got it through Ronald Lauder. Ronald Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder, he was in charge of the privatization scheme for New York State. And in this scheme, they decided to privatize the World Trade Center. Now, Mr. Lauder also funds a school at Mossad University in Israel called the IDC. And at the IDC, the person who runs his school is Major General Danny Rothschild. The Rothschild family of Britain and France, they built Israel. They paid for Israel. They built the first 30 settlements. The first one is called Rishon LeZion, the first in Zion. That's where Danny Rothschild was born. So they made a few children as well to carry on the family genes. Now, what's the connection between Larry Silverstein and the buildings? Well, the Port Authority owned the World Trade Center. The Port Authority was headed by this man, Lou Eisenberg, another Zionist. There were some very convoluted negotiations in the summer of 2001, and the World Trade Center passed to Larry Silverstein. These two men are on the board of the United Jewish Appeal, the largest funding organization for the state of Israel in the United States of America. So it was the Zionist connection that got the building to Larry Silverstein. Larry Silverstein also happens to be a very close friend of Bibi Netanyahu. This is from the Israeli media. For years, Netanyahu and Silverstein have kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was, he would always call. And their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister. What were they talking about every Sunday afternoon for years? Well, finally, Larry Silverstein, on July 24th, he got the Twin Towers in his hand. And then he controlled everything about the building. The first thing he did was he jacked the rent up 40% and insured it against terrorism. This is what was left 5 weeks later of the World Trade Center. All that was left was steel and dust. And on September 11th, the Israeli military chief, Ehud Barak, the one who had trained Osama bin Laden, came on the BBC. He happened to be in London. He happened to be in the studio of the BBC World Television, the largest television network in the English-speaking world, and he said this. He said, it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. He said the world will never be the same from today on, and he blamed Osama bin Laden. What's the connection here? Ehud Barak was the commander of Bibi Netanyahu in a covert commando force called the Sayeret Matkal. This is a covert independent commando force that serves directly under the Israeli Chief of Staff and military intelligence. On 9/11, this man with the New York Police Department hat, his name is Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of Israel. He was in New York City on September 10th and 11th, but his presence was kept out of the news completely. Why? What was he doing in September 10th and 11th in New York City that had to be kept secret? Here he is with Bibi Netanyahu. Here he is 9 days later, 10 days later, comes and sits next to Mr. Giuliani. You see, New York City and Jerusalem are sister cities. And this man was the mayor of Jerusalem. And he comes to New York City, and it's not reported. It would usually be front page news. Then the Israeli son of the Mossad, Michael Chertoff, this man here, controlled the 9/11 investigation. He was put in charge. He was the assistant attorney general. He was supposed to prosecute the crimes of 9/11. But they didn't even investigate the crime. There has never been an investigation of 9/11. Full stop. John Ashcroft put Michael Chertoff in charge of the investigation, and then what he did, he oversaw the destruction of evidence, the destruction and confiscation of the critical evidence. It was a cover-up from the very beginning. Then George Bush made him head of Homeland Security, number 2, in which position he remained in charge of the evidence. Then 13, the Zionists controlled junkyards, 2 of them in New Jersey. They managed the destruction of the evidence. The evidence was taken to their junkyard, cut into small pieces, mixed with other scrap, and shipped to Asia. At a time when the price of scrap steel was the lowest it had been in 50 years, this was destruction of evidence. This was not business. This is a pile of steel. All the steel was destroyed. And then the Zionists, a Zionist again is a supporter of Israel, they presided over the 9/11 lawsuits and tort litigation. There were 3,000 victims. That was a lot of litigation. It all went to this man, Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein in Manhattan. Now there's a problem here. His son is a lawyer in Israel who works for the key defendant in the 9/11 litigation, that company I told you about, ICTS, the people who were responsible for this passenger screening at the airports. If those 19 hijackers got on the plane, they would know how they got on. The conflict of interest was his son was working, as I said, for the law firm that controlled that ICTS company. So that's a primary family conflict of interest. A judge cannot oversee a case when his son or his wife is working for the defendant. That's completely not right. And then we had, as I said, 3,000 victims. The first 2,900 victims were given money out of the compensation fund, which was managed by Kenneth Feinberg, another Zionist. He gave the money to the people, then they had to sign a line where they wouldn't talk about how much money they got or the terms. There were 100 families left. They held out for a court process, and they were treated with Sheila Birnbaum. One by one, every single family was settled out of court. So all 3,000 families were settled out of court, and there has not been one day in court for a single 9/11 victim. That's not justice. This is Judge Mukasey. This is the fellow Zionist judge who oversaw the court process in the 1993 bombing. And he then oversaw Larry Silverstein's insurance claim with the insurance companies, where Larry Silverstein got paid twice for the destruction of his buildings. He made from $100 million of a down payment with borrowed money, he got something like $5 billion. The 15th point is Benjamin Netanyahu admits that 9/11 benefits Israel. He said on 9/11 to the New York Times, he was asked, how will this affect Israeli-American relations? And Netanyahu said, it's very good. It will generate immediate sympathy. Who would say it's very good when there are 30,000 people who are thought to be in the rubble dead? A couple years later, he said in Hebrew, speaking to an Israeli audience, he said, we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. Israel is benefiting from that, not America. And then the point that the Zionists control the myth. They wrote the myth. This man, Philip Zelikow, was in charge of the 9/11 Commission. And he wrote the outline for the report before the people even began working on the report. And this man's specialty, he went to school, he's a Zionist. He went to school and he got a master's degree or a PhD on the creation and maintenance of the public myth. Because what we've been sold is a myth. We've been told a myth that Islam is trying to attack our nation. And unfortunately, Donald Trump still supports that myth. He was in Tampa the other day, and he said radical Islamic terrorists are determined to attack this nation, as they did on 9/11. That's false. And for Donald Trump to say that that's the case is a very, very dangerous thing. And here's the people who worked on the report. They said, this is the John Farmer, counsel for the report. He said what the government told us about what they told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. And these are the commissioners themselves, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. Thomas Keane said, to this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. So the American people have been given a pack of lies about what happened on 9/11. And it's time we wake up from this nightmare. And my last point is that then if you go to Ground Zero, if you go to New York City, there's a big memorial there, and there's a strange building called the Oculus, and there's a shopping mall, and they have these ponds, and there's names are carved in granite around the ponds. This was designed and given to us by the Israelis. The Israeli engineer, the Israeli designer who built it is this man here. The World Trade Center Memorial was designed by a friend of the Netanyahu family. His name is Michael Arad. He's the son of Moshe Arad, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. This is how they want to control the story. They give you the idea for the story, they control the story, they make it happen, and then they control the legacy. So young American kids go to this Ground Zero, and they go through a museum that's run by Israelis, built and run by Israelis, to teach them the lie that Islam did this to America. Here's Mayor Bloomberg talking to Netanyahu. They're discussing the 4 Israelis who died at 9/11. This is 10 years after the fact. Now, the critical thing is that the media has been lying to us. This is the New York Times, a Zionist-owned newspaper, family of the B'nai B'rith. 3 years after 9/11, they came out with this editorial of the paper, and they said, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. How Orwellian is that? And for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed the false story about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing all evidence that disproves the official myth. Why does the media do this? Because we have today, almost all of the media in this country is owned by 6 companies. And those 6 companies are owned by the Rothschilds. Here we have media moguls like Rupert Murdoch, who push the lies about 9/11 and the war on terror. They are complicit in a criminal cover-up with the people who did 9/11. Now, the Rothschild banksters create people like Mr. Murdoch so they control all the public opinion in this country. That's what the media in the country today, in NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox News, it's psychological warfare against the American people 24/7. And this is my final slide. This is summing up my analysis, and this is from Dr. Alan Sabrowski, who wrote this paper called Treason, Betrayal, and Deceit, 9/11 Beyond. And he said the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, AIPAC, the Israeli lobby and their cohorts, through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration and back to the Israeli government. None of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. And that's what I'm saying, is that we've been fooled, we've been tricked, we've been deceived into a war, and this is not our interest at all. This is an Israeli war agenda that we have been tricked into fighting. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum.
Very powerful, very powerful. Let's hear it for him one more time.